So, as Jasmine mentioned at the beginning, we were supposed to have a further speaker, my colleague Marwa Kessinger, who's a Sudanese activist, and she's of Nubian origin and in Sudan, and very active in Sudanese organising in this country. And unfortunately, she's unwell. So I'm going to be speaking about Sudan, and I've talked to her about some of the things we spoke just before the meeting, and she said there were a number of points she wanted me to put across to you. So I'll talk first a bit about Sudan and then move on to some more general points, really following on from the where Tawfiq left off about the question of where does change come from? Where does real democracy come from? How can we turn the spirit that you so wonderfully described that it animates the movement in Algeria, and as I'll talk about, is very much present in the streets of Sudan at the moment. How can we turn that into a different kind of society? Is it something that just has to be put back in the bottle? We go back to business as usual, or could we actually build on that energy to really change the world? And the point that I'm going to finish on really as the point of discussion is about the question of the state. Again, something that Tawfiq brought up very, very clearly in his contribution. So to start off in terms of the movement in Sudan, I don't know whether people have followed the protests that emerged in Sudan over the last 4 months. There has been quite a bit of coverage since the 6th of April in the mainstream media in this country, but much less before that. So in many cases, people may not be aware that actually this was a movement that began back last December. And in fact, as I'll explain, has quite deep roots in over previous recent years. One of the points that Marwa particularly wanted me to tell you about is that, as far as she knows, the incident that really sparked off the wave of protests over the huge economic crisis and the rise in the cost of living was actually sparked off by students, university students who were protesting about the fact that their falafel sandwiches had gone up in price. So this was an example of just how very small things pushed people over the edge. Why did they push people over the edge? Because Sudan has been suffering from an enormous economic crisis for many years, which has intensified because the regime that actually remains in power, although it's badly wounded, is like the Algerian regime, a regime of people who are thieves, who have stolen the wealth of the Sudanese people. Sudan is also a very rich country, both in natural resources of many different sorts, agricultural resources, and also there is also oil and gas in parts of Sudan. One of the triggers for the economic crisis was, in fact, the secession of South Sudan and it becoming an independent country. And al-Bashir's regime has a shameful criminal record in terms of the genocidal wars that the Sudanese army and militias have launched against people in parts of the country. So in terms of the wars that went on with the South, among people from the Nubian areas, from South Kordofan, and also very importantly in terms of Darfur, which is in the west of the country. So that background to the economic crisis is quite important, but the spark for it really was the overnight tripling of prices for bread and basic food, which led to demonstrations taking place across the country. And another point that Marwa wanted me to really bring out here is that the movement in Sudan is one that has really brought out all the sectors of Sudanese society that have been the most oppressed, and particularly, actually, young women and girls have played an enormously courageous role leading the revolution. There are numerous examples of practical things that young women have been involved with, from leading the protests. There is one of the young women who's become a kind of icon of the revolution. It became famous for picking up tear gas canisters and throwing them back at the security forces. So her image was repeated over social media and many places. Another initiative that many young women were involved with, which Mara wanted me to mention, was Facebook groups, which up until the revolution began, were actually largely dedicated to discussing fashion or cooking or everyday life, suddenly turned their skills to identifying police officers. So they would go, this person, that's a copper. And they shamed them in public on the Facebook groups, and then people would identify them in the demonstrations, go, you're a policeman, we're not talking to you, or push them out of the protests, isolated them, and so on. Again, not using violence, despite the fact that in the case of Sudan there has been quite severe repression of the protests, much more so actually than Algeria until recently. There have been very brutal attacks on protesters. Another point that I want to mention here, though, is about how what started as spontaneous protests, where people just felt they had had too much, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, that the fact that they couldn't feed their kids, they couldn't get money out of the cash machine, just pushed people onto the streets. But actually very quickly it became an organised movement, and that is because organisation by people like the Sudanese Professionals Association, by doctors, by teachers, by journalists, is at the heart of this movement. So the Sudanese Professionals Association actually was set up in 2016. One of the key forces behind it is junior doctors. People in this country will remember our junior doctors went on strike. Actually, in Sudan, junior doctors went on strike over different contexts, but many similar issues. It was a strike actually that was triggered by the terrible conditions in Sudanese hospitals, and particularly the everyday violence that doctors face and health workers face in doing their jobs. And the network of strike committees and so on that doctors had put up was one of the constituent parts of the Sudanese Professionals Association. And there were a whole range of other groups, most of them kind of public sector workers, teachers, doctors, university lecturers and university workers, journalists, lawyers, and so on. And actually, it's not only professionals who have been involved in in strikes as well. Over the course of the last few months, as the movement has grown in strength, we've also had massive strike action by port workers in Port Sudan, by cement workers, by a whole range of different groups of organised workers taking part in the movement. The final point really that Marwa wanted to emphasise actually comes back to the point that Tawfiq made about the question of the debates that are taking place in the movement in Sudan at the moment about how to deal with the question of state power. And in the case of Sudan, as people will probably have seen, since the 6th of April, this question has been pushed much further up the political agenda in terms of the real question about who runs the state is being decided really in a contestation between people on the streets of Khartoum, of Port Sudan, of Atbara, of all the towns and cities where people are involved in the revolution, and the generals who run the Sudanese state. There is negotiations were taking place between representatives of the organisers of the protests, grouped around a manifesto called the Declaration of Freedom and Change, which is a set of principles for a transitional period, a civilian-led transitional period, getting rid of al-Bashir's regime, its one-party state, bringing in justice, of empowering women, of addressing the questions of justice for people who've suffered in the wars in Sudan, and addressing the question of social justice. And those negotiations are ongoing. In order to get into a position to negotiate with the military, it took a popular uprising. So the sit-in that started outside the military high command in massive numbers on the 6th of April was actually the key breakthrough that forced the generals to remove al-Bashir. But they're not going to give up easily. They, as was referred to at the beginning, immediately one of the generals appointed himself as the leader of a transitional military council. He lasted 24 hours before he was sacked in favour of another one of the generals, one who's currently head of the transitional military council. The person who he appointed as his second in command is known as Hemeti. He is actually the commander of the rapid support forces, who are the one of the most notorious militias run by the Sudanese government. People may have heard of a militia called the Janjaweed, which was involved with ethnic cleansing, with rape on a mass scale in Darfur and in other places. Actually, the rapid support forces are a reversioning of the Janjaweed. It includes many of the same people. Hemeti has also led Sudan's ground forces in Yemen, where they've been fighting on behalf of the Saudi-led military coalition in Yemen. And this is the person who actually, kind of as we speak, has been warning demonstrators and warning the protesters outside the sit-in at the military headquarters that they will tolerate no more chaos. So you really get a sense of what's at stake here. So in the remaining time, I really want to come on then to where that leads us. That leads us, I think, directly to a question of the state, this mix of bureaucracy and army, the armed bodies of men who use the state as an instrument not to govern society, I would argue, but use the state as an instrument of class power for ensuring that robbery takes place on a grand scale, that ordinary people are exploited and oppressed, that when we have a vote, it means nothing, that the people behind the scene whose Tawfiq put up some of their portraits from Algeria, you have a very similar mix of people from Sudan, the generals, the corrupt businessmen, the bureaucrats and politicians who parcel up power and wealth in society and laugh in the faces of ordinary people. I would argue that actually that's what the state in a capitalist society is. There isn't anything else that it is. That the state in our society is something that can't be just taken and reformed by ordinary people. I'd look back actually to the experience of previous revolutions. So you look at the experience of the Paris Commune, you look at the experience of the Russian Revolution, and actually some of the most important insights that came out of those previous revolutionary experiences, I would argue, were precisely on the question of the state. But we do have things on our side, and I think that the Algerian, ordinary people in Algeria, ordinary people in Sudan are showing this on a daily basis. Tawfiq gave a fantastic descriptions of how ordinary people organise themselves in the protest. Absolutely the same story in the sit-in outside the military high command in Khartoum. People are organising the security of the area. They are organising food, they are organising water, they are organising medical care. And it's the things like the checkpoints that really are annoying people like Hemeti. He's saying it's actually not the chaos that he's afraid of. He is afraid because they have shown they are better organised than him. He is afraid because actually the chaos that they bring, ordinary people are shown we have an alternative to that. We have an alternative to a society that is riven with violence between people of different races, of different languages, of different genders. They are saying we have an alternative which we can create for ourselves. Now, we can only see it in embryo at the moment in Algeria and Sudan, but it's definitely there. And the question then comes, what do we have in response that we can use against these bodies of armed men, against people who have blood on their hands, on an absolutely unbelievable scale? Well, actually, we have the power that we make society work, that the profits that people like Hemeti are creaming off, or the profits that are going to people in Saudi Arabia from the major companies, the Saudi ruling class that is investing in Sudan, is taking agricultural land in Sudan, for example, in order to run dairy farms and create alfalfa, cattle fodder, so that they can feed people in the Gulf. That's produced by Sudanese farmers and Sudanese workers. In the case of Algeria, the gas and the oil is pumped out by ordinary workers. The cars that roll off the production line in Roiba and the old industrial sectors in Algeria are produced by ordinary workers. The teachers who teach in the schools, the doctors who run the hospitals, actually they have a power as organised workers, which is very difficult to break simply by repression. I'm not saying that you can't take someone with a gun and go and kill doctors in a hospital. Actually, that's what al-Bashir's forces were doing during the uprising. But it didn't work because people were organised. They used their power in order to, actually, not their power to bring chaos, their power to organise, their power to run society despite the people at the top. And that is what needs to be refined, made more concrete, given greater democratic force. Actually, the debates that are taking place in the workplaces are incredibly important. In both Algeria and Sudan, I've noticed that there have been mass marches by the people who work in the state media. So the workers in Algeria who work in the TV station had a big protest demanding an end to censorship, saying basically we should run this better than you. In Sudan, in a couple of days, the Sudanese Professionals Association has announced a march on the state TV and state radio. I hope they will be arguing for the same things, of saying that if we use that power as organised workers, that we can actually bring something into being that is not the same as the society we've got, that is a real challenge to the existing state despite its power. And the final point that I want to end on is, so how can we do this? What sorts of organisation can really make a difference? Now, in a revolutionary situation, again, as Tawfiq said very graphically, there are thousands, hundreds, millions of people who are involved in organising the protests. We need those broad organisations. You need trade unions, you need youth movements, you need mass organisations in order to mobilise people on a scale that can actually disrupt the power of the state. But also, I would argue, I think we need something that is more tightly concentrated, that is an organisation of revolutionaries that understands the question about the state, a revolutionary party. Actually, to go back to, you mentioned the Bolsheviks, like the Bolsheviks, that kind of organisation that brings together an understanding of the relationship between the economic and the political struggles, that can centralise organisation on our side while still being part of a project that is inherently far more democratic, that is pushing towards a kind of democracy that expands it from just being in the realm of the political and into everyday life, that forces the question of democracy into the workplaces, that uses those powers in order to change society. But I think that does require tight, centralised organisation, because the other side is centralised. They are organised, and their power will not be broken unless we are also organised. So really, that's where I would finish, with the question of saying, I hope this is something that we can discuss, both among ourselves as activists in this country, because our state, the British state, has a terrible record in relation to supporting dictators, including directly supporting al-Bashir in Sudan. But also, this is a discussion we want to have with our comrades in the Middle East, with Algerian and Sudanese revolutionaries, just as we've been having with comrades from Syria, from Egypt, from Tunisia, over their experiences, about how do we forge that kind of organisation that can really help to change society, to bring into being the things that we see in embryo, that we go beyond the idea of a republic of dreams, which is what people talked about in Tahrir Square in 2011, and we make that a reality, because I believe we can.